Բարի երեկո, սիրելիներ։ Շատ շնորհակալություն ձեր ներկայության համար։ Այսօր հայագիտական ուսման ծրագիրը պատիվը ունի հյուրընկալելու դոկտոր Arsène Saparovը, որ պիտի խոսի 1965-ի ապրիլի 24-ի Եղեռնի 50-ամյակի առիթով Երևանի մեջ տեղի ունեցած ցույցերու բարականներուն եւ այսօր որպես հետևանք խորհրդային միության բռնած թիրքին մասին. Hello all, and welcome to the program of Armenian Studies 6th event this year. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Arsène Saparov for accepting our invitation to come and speak to us today about the Soviet response to growing Armenian nationalism. Dr. Arsène Saparov earned his PhD from the LSE in the year 2000. After working for 2 years at the CNRC in France, he taught at the History Department at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he published a book on the ethnic conflict in the Caucasus entitled From Conflict to Autonomy in the Caucasus. He is currently Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Sharjah, UAE. On April 24th, 1965, mass demonstrations took place in the Armenian capital commemorating the 50th anniversary of the genocide in the Ottoman Empire. This was a unique event in the Soviet Union where such unauthorized protests were frequently met with lethal violence. What was the background of these demonstrations? Why did the authorities in Moscow not disperse the demonstrations? How did these demonstrations affect the development of Armenian nationalism? This presentation will explore these questions and the relationship between the Soviet authorities, the local authorities, and the advent of greater Armenian nationalism. It is thus with great pleasure that I introduce today Dr. Arsène Saparov.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank your Armenian Studies program and specifically Krikor for inviting me. I'm on my way to another conference, so I thought I would do this presentation here. And we pretty much started with what I wanted to focus upon today. I'm pretty much sure everyone in this classroom, in this audience, knows that on April 24, 1965, there were very large unauthorized demonstrations in capital of Soviet Armenia taking place. What is unusual about this event, I find, is that, number one, there was no violence. No state violence was directed against the demonstrations, even so usually, if you look in a very recent Soviet past, there was usually violence. In just 2 or 3 years before these events in 1965, there were unauthorized demonstrations in a Russian town of Novocherkassk in the North Caucasus that were suppressed. There were the whole bunch of people killed, several dozen people were killed, a lot of people were put on trial. 10 years before that, in Georgian capital, there were again unauthorized demonstrations against the removal of Stalin. And again, Soviet authorities responded with violence. So what was unusual about the Armenian event is that there was no violence perpetrated by the central authorities. And that kind of started me thinking, so why Moscow responded in a way it responded? And once I started looking into the whole subject, it became clear that there are actually more questions, such as, for example, why local authorities were actually quite permissive to the public mobilization, why people on the ground would risk, because this is Soviet Union, it's very, very risky thing to kind of challenge the Soviet authorities, why people on the ground would risk their positions, their careers, sometimes their freedom, and try to challenge the existing regime. So under the umbrella of these questions, I was trying to look at this event of April 24, 1965, and the way I'm framing today's presentation is actually a bit complicated, so I will kind of provide you some framework of what I'm going to do. I want to look at 3 elements that were interacting in 1965, in April 1965 in Armenian capital. Number one, I will look at the public, why public was involved, what public's role was there. The second level I'm going to look at is the local authorities, the Communist Party of Soviet Armenia, how they reacted to the grassroots mobilization, how they presented it to Moscow. The third level is the Moscow itself, why Moscow reacted in a way it reacted. So this is kind of one level of analysis that I'm going to do. The other level of analysis is not focusing so much on events of 1965 itself. It's more looking at these events in a bigger, longer-term perspective. I want to look what happened before. I want to look what happened on April 24th, 1965, and I want to look at what happened afterwards. So I'm placing this event in the middle of the trajectory of the Armenian nationalism within the Soviet Union. I will recap very briefly of what happened on April 24, 1965. In the morning, there were mass demonstrations taking place in Armenian capital. It looks like the Armenian authorities completely lost control of the situation. The police didn't intervene, the KGB didn't intervene, the authorities themselves didn't know how to react to these demonstrations, and the culmination of the whole thing was in the evening when the crowds broke into the opera theater in the downtown of the Armenian capital, and they basically occupied the stage and made a pronouncement of nationalist slogans. So this is, in a nutshell, what happened on April 24th. Now, the question I want to start asking is, what basically brought these things about? And I'm cheating here, and I will explain you why I'm cheating here later on. One of the reasons I'm going to kind of address this question in a second. In a later part of the presentation, I will explain why I'm cheating here. My cheating begins by choosing one date. I'm choosing a date in November 1964. So this is something like half a year before the events take place. The leadership of the Soviet Armenian Communist Party is writing a letter to Moscow, to the Central Committee, and they're asking for the permission to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the genocide in Soviet Armenia. Now, I'm pretty much sure there are not many historians here, so I will indulge myself very briefly, and I will kind of give you a background of what is letter writing to the Soviet authorities. There is a whole kind of literature of people writing to the Soviet Union. Some people would usually present themselves as a very loyal Soviet subjects, completely devoted to the Soviet cause, and they would ask something in return. There was a whole bunch of other letters where people would present themselves as in a very miserable way. They basically will be lamenting and presenting themselves as completely destitute and in a need of urgent help. There was a third category of letters where people would outright threaten the Soviet authorities. So there is a whole genre of this kind of letter writing. And what is amazing about this Armenian Communist Party letter to Moscow is that it combines all three of them. They start this letter by saying how loyal the Armenians have always been, not to the Soviet Union, but to Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. The second stage is the lamentation. They have the entire paragraph devoted to what happened to Armenians because of their pro-Russian orientation. So they suffered the genocide in the Ottoman Empire because they were pro-Russian. The third part is basically they start making threats. They saying, and this is a very interesting part, they saying that abroad the Armenians are commemorating the 50th anniversary of the genocide in Armenian communities abroad. We never commemorated this in Soviet Union. That doesn't look good. It's damaging to the Soviet Union. If we don't commemorate it this year, people will start asking why Soviet Union doesn't commemorate Armenian genocide within the Soviet Union. Is something wrong with the Soviet Union? They're actually saying that in this letter. And the final bit is a cherry on top. So what they want? They want very, very simple things. They want publication in the local newspapers commemorating the victims. And they want, and I will kind of make an emphasis on this word, they want to build an obelisk. And remember this word because it will come later on in a presentation. They want obelisk, and they want to have a commemorative lecture, which will be a closed event on the achievements of Soviet Armenia, basically showing that thanks to Moscow, we basically survived and managed to overcome the consequences of genocide. Now, this is happening in November 1964. It took Moscow several months before they finally replied. The reply comes in January 1965. So if you have this mental image, January is 3 months before April. So they have very, very short time to start preparing. And they start preparing in a rush. So suddenly, once Moscow allowed them to hold the commemorative events, they start publishing in the newspapers that there will be commemorations. They start organizing events, etc., etc., etc. And eventually, we arrive to April 1924, and I think what happened there was basically disjuncture between what the local authorities prepared to commemorate the 50th anniversary and what people were expecting. People were expecting a proper, true commemoration. What the Soviet authorities presented was pretty much standard Soviet ritual of commemorating something, holding some secret lectures, and not really condemning what happened. And that, I think, was a catalyst that brought people on the streets, because they were feeling that there is inadequate commemorations being offered by the Soviet authorities, etc., etc., etc. So this leads eventually to what happened on April 24, 1965. I will spend a few minutes discussing what exactly happened there, because it gives us some ideas. First of all, there was no central organization. From what I'm realizing from the reports is there were separate meetings taking place in the Soviet capital. Some people went to Komitas, not memorial, Pantheon. It's a park in Yerevan where Komitas is buried. It's located in a working district, pretty far away from the center. But that was a logical place for people to go and commemorate. Because Komitas was victim of the genocide, this is where people went. Some other people went to the other place where usually the Soviet symbolism was taking place. They went to the square of Lenin. This square is usually reserved exclusively for very kind of Soviet commemorations, like November 7th, the October Revolution Day, May 1st, the Working Day Parade, and they are holding this nationalist really event in this very Soviet place. The Soviet authorities didn't know what to do. If they allow people on the ground to hijack Lenin Square and hold the nationalist slogans, it will look very bad. So their reaction is to send members of Communist Party to kind of channel it into the right direction. And it actually backfired, because when the Communist Party showed up on this unauthorized meeting on the Lenin Square, it somehow gave legitimacy to what people were saying. So there were very bizarre scenes taking place on Lenin Square. On the one hand, people are shouting, return of our lands, condemn the genocide. On the other hand, they are sending telegrams to Moscow thanking the Soviet Communist Party for basically saving Armenia. Very bizarre kind of thing, completely un-Soviet, but mixing these things. By the end of the day, in the evening, I pretty much believe the entire city was aware of what is happening. People gathered on Opera Square. And it was in this Opera Square where they were holding this closed meeting to commemorate the achievements of Soviet Armenia. So there are huge crowds outside the Opera Theater, and there is closed meeting inside Opera Theater. So there is a complete inadequacy of the event taking place inside opera and huge crowds outside Opera Theater. So people really felt that what is happening inside belongs to people outside, and they broke into the Opera Theater. And once they broke in, some people who were only invited to be inside started to applaud them. So it looked really, really bad for the Soviet authorities in Armenia. They had to make explanation to Moscow and come up with an explanation of what is happening there. Now, I said earlier that I cheated, and I started in 1964, in November 1964. I started with this letter. I didn't ask the question which is very important. Why would Soviet Armenian authorities in November 1964 write such a letter to Moscow asking to hold these commemorations? I mean, everybody knew Moscow will not be happy about this. Everybody knew that they don't like nationalism in Moscow. And still these people were writing this letter, putting themselves at risk. Later on, the head of the Armenian Communist Party was lost his position just because he didn't manage it properly. And here is another kind of level which deals with a large kind of part of what I'm trying to look at, a large period before 1965, what was leading up to it. And I will very briefly give you a background of what was happening. In Soviet Armenia, Armenians were not allowed to mention any lands that were lost to the Ottoman Empire, to the Turkey, because in the 20s, the Soviet Union perceived Armenian demands as imperialists. Later, they didn't want to spoil the relationship with Turkey, etc., etc., etc. So the entire subject was suppressed. On the other hand, a very large proportion of the Armenian population was made up of refugees who escaped from the Ottoman Empire. So there is a bizarre situation. A lot of people inside Armenia know something happened to their families in the Ottoman Empire, and they can't talk about it. So this has always been present in the Armenian society. During the Stalinist period, you can quite clearly imagine you can't really mention these things. It's pretty much dangerous. But in 1945, Stalin is beginning this campaign to reclaim some lands from Turkey and some land from Iran. And as a part of this campaign, Stalin authorizes Armenians and Georgians to publish a number of books claiming the territories in the Ottoman Empire. They didn't claim them in open way, but they were basically writing histories about the former Armenian and Georgian kingdoms in the Ottoman Empire, on the territory of Ottoman Empire, something that way never done before. The other thing Stalin did is he started to resettle. They started a large resettlement program for the Armenians living in the Middle East mostly. In 1947, the program was authorized. By 1949, approximately 80,000 people were relocated from Middle East mostly into the Soviet Armenia with an expectation that there will be lands annexed from the Turkey where these people would be able to settle. The lands never arrived. These people got stuck in Soviet Armenia. Now, what happened to these people was they brought this idea that April 24th is being commemorated in the Armenian communities abroad. So the Armenian public in Armenia knows that the Armenians are commemorating it, but they are not commemorating it in Soviet Armenia. And then we have Khrushchev. Khrushchev makes, I don't know what would be the right word. He starts a program of de-Stalinization. People are able to speak more freely, and it is within these programs that the Armenians who have all this background, people who survived genocide, lived in Soviet Armenia, people who resettled from Middle East and lived in Soviet Armenia, are beginning to speak. And from this period, I have very interesting letters which basically demonstrate this is actually, I'm sorry, this is a letter that the Armenian government sent to Moscow in November 64. And this is, I think, where they make the threat. It's not direct threat, but it's very clearly telling the Soviet authorities that if you guys don't listen to us, there will be problems back at home. So, but getting back to what I was saying, by early 60s, people are beginning to express their anxieties in this new situation where you are able to say things. And what I find interesting is we have the entire variety of opinions, ranging from very clearly anti-Soviet opinions. There was a very well-known case of 7 people actually creating a clandestine organization with the aim of don't love separating Armenia from Soviet Union and reclaiming the territories from the Turkey. I'm not sure how they were planning to do that, but obviously that wasn't seen as childish by the Soviet authorities because these 7 people were arrested and got long prison terms. Then the more interesting bit is we have another spectrum of opinions, and these opinions are ranging from very loyal Soviet opinions. This is what I called, there is the guy behind this letter, and I called this an optimist letter. He is completely devoted to Soviet Union, and he doesn't see anything wrong with these Armenian demands for return of territories and recognition of genocide and the Soviet project. So he's writing this very loyal letter, and he signs this letter to Moscow, and he's basically saying that that we basically need to kind of recognize the genocide, and we need to transfer the whole bunch of territories from Azerbaijan and Georgia to Soviet Armenia. And I love this. He doesn't realize how funny the last paragraph sounds when he makes these claims that we shouldn't kind of give way to nationalists and anti-Soviet elements after all these territorial demands to the Georgians and Azerbaijanis. So this guy is an optimist. Then there is another letter, and I would call this guy a very sarcastic letter. This guy is not so much believing in Soviet Union. He is more poking them, which is very dangerous thing to do, and he is signing this letter with his own name, and there are repercussions for him. So here he is making a somewhat veiled threat, very similar to the one that the Soviet authorities did. But I think he sent this letter to the guys in Moscow, and they didn't miss the sarcasm of the letter. So the letter came back to Armenia with a note that you have to invite this guy for the conversation into the Central Committee. And I found the third letter, which I'm not bringing here because it's too long and it's difficult to flesh out the necessary details. But the letter is basically very important because the guy is very experienced writer, but he starts his letter by saying that I'm not an experienced writer. And after a few paragraphs, it becomes clear that he's clearly basically doing this to protect himself. He is doing something very important. He is joining together 2 issues, the issue of genocide and issue of lost territories to Azerbaijan and Georgia together. So in his letter, he is bringing very clear ideas that in order to address the injustice of genocide, you have to give back to the Armenians the territories that they lost. So this is a fusion of these 2 on a surface separate issues, which are becoming fused in a consciousness of the people in Armenia.
The year?
Sorry?
The year of today's
this is just before 1965. This is still before. So this is a background against which the Soviet Armenian authorities were writing that first letter to Moscow. They didn't write because they were patriots. They were writing because the mood in the public was changing. So what is happening after 1965? So after 1965, it's a big scandal. It's a very big disaster for the Armenian Communist Party. The head of the Communist Party, Yerevan, would lose his position later on. And Moscow was very clearly determined not to have any more demonstrations in Soviet Armenian capital next year. So in 1966, they put a lot of police, and police had a very clear directives not to allow any demonstrations to take place in Soviet Armenia. But what happened was there was an authorized demonstration in Soviet capital in Moscow. There was about 200 Armenians who gathered on Armenian cemetery in Moscow, held posters demanding the return of the land, held posters celebrating the Soviet authority. So it was a very bizarre scene because on the one hand they're putting nationalist slogans, on the other hand they're putting pro-Soviet slogans. So the Soviet authorities again didn't know what to do with these guys. They finally dispersed them because they wanted to march to the Turkish embassy, and the Soviet Union couldn't allow that. Then in 1967, the Armenians built the obelisk, remember I said pay attention to the word obelisk that they are requesting from Moscow. They built the obelisk. Now, probably many people here have been there or have seen the images of the memorial to the genocide that was built in Soviet Armenia. This is anything but an obelisk. There is an obelisk, but the whole thing is much bigger than what they were describing in their letters to Moscow. So they built a whole memorial to commemorate the genocide. That wasn't in the plans. That's not what they promised to Moscow. They promised something small and cute, but nothing big like that. And in 1967, that became a rallying point for demonstrations that were taking place every year on April 24th of each year. Now, this is a very interesting thing because if you look at the map of Yerevan, this genocide memorial is located far away from sacred places of communist pantheon, far from Lenin Square, so they didn't want any repetition of this very bizarre demonstration on Lenin Square, which is exclusively reserved for the Soviet kind of monuments and Soviet commemorative events, and they moved it to slightly remote area of the town. But by 1967, the local authorities developed a completely new script how to commemorate these events. The whole thing would start in the morning. The Communist Party leadership would lead the demonstration of the people. They put the flowers there from the Communist Party so that they don't lose the control of these events. They don't lose it to some grassroots movements. Because this is dangerous. If the Communist Party doesn't control crowds, it means they're not in charge of the population. So they lead the demonstrations. In the second half of the day, there is a minute of silence, which is being held on TV, on the radio. Then the newspapers are publishing articles, etc., etc., etc. So this is a very scripted ritual that would be repeated every single year between 1967 and until the collapse of the Soviet Union and afterwards. Now, what is interesting about this is it has been completely unofficial. So it looks like it's a national mourning day, but it's not. It's a standard working day, and it's not mentioned in any way as some special occasion. By late 70s, the local communist authorities are starting to write letters to Moscow asking Moscow to allow them to recognize April 24th as a national mourning day in Soviet Armenia, not in the Soviet Union. And every single time that will be discussed on a meeting of Politburo, and I have the names of the people who discussed it, and every single time they would say no. So a very bizarre situation. On the one hand, the Armenians are able to demonstrate on this date with the leadership of the Communist Party. On the other hand, it's completely unofficial. And even in 1987, when Karabakh conflict is beginning to unravel, and another letter was sent in 1989 when the conflict is in a full scale, and the Armenian Communist Party is very rapidly losing any legitimacy inside the Armenian population, for the Armenian population, Moscow says, no, you can't do that. So until the very end, until the very collapse of the Soviet Union, that remained no. It's in a way I kind of trace the trajectory of the Armenian nationalism and Armenian attitude towards the issue of genocide, and I'm probably ready for some conclusions, and I have pretty unusual conclusions. The conclusion number one is, surprisingly, Moscow shows a lot of flexibility when dealing with this kind of issue in its periphery. Rather than just deciding, no, you're not going to do anything about it, they realize, well, if we are not going to do anything about it, it will probably backfire. These Armenians will start hating Moscow rather than hating Turkey, so maybe on a balance, it's easier to allow them to commemorate this genocide and blame it on Turkey rather than start blaming it on Moscow. So they show a lot of flexibility here. The second element, the people, why people would do that. And my impression is that people were not dissidents. A lot of them were actually truly supportive of the Soviet project, of the Soviet regime, and some of these letters are demonstrating that. What is happening, they don't see any incompatibility with what they're asking and with the Soviet project. So when it became possible to ask these questions, they sincerely and honestly are asking these questions. They don't see why commemoration of genocide is completely anti-Soviet or incompatible with the Soviet Union, or why the transfer of the territories is against Soviet Union because Comrade Lenin was very much in favor of solving the nationality problem, etc., etc., etc. So again, I'm here differing from the usual perception that all of these people were dissidents. I think what I'm seeing here is much more medium position. They're not really against Soviet Union. Very many of them, a lot of them are in favor of Soviet Union. Now the third element, why would local Armenian authorities try to petition Moscow, perfectly knowing that petitioning Moscow on such a sensitive topic can backfire? And a lot of people lost their jobs and had problems with their careers because they actually wrote these letters to Moscow. And here again, I don't think they were truly patriotic. They were more quite actually pragmatic in doing this. They were managers. They were placed by Moscow in charge of Soviet Armenia in order to keep it quiet and peaceful. And in order to keep it quiet and peaceful, they had to keep population happy. So if they just completely refuse to commemorate any genocide-related events, the population will not be happy. The population will start commemorating it on their own. So in order to keep the population quiet, they need to get some concessions from Moscow. That's what they're doing. They're getting concessions from Moscow to keep population happy, to appear in the eyes of Moscow as a very successful managers of this region. Now Moscow. It looks like Moscow won, because what they did. They allowed Armenians to commemorate it once a year, with all the negative emotions going towards Turkey, practically zero negative emotions going towards Moscow, so it's a clear win. It looks like that. They didn't lose much. They allowed people to commemorate, and in return they didn't have to give any territories back. They didn't even have to recognize it as an official commemorative day. It looks like that on a surface, but what happened in a long-term perspective, I think, it allowed the Armenian public to mobilize around these two issues: the issue of genocide recognition and the issue of the territories that they lost. And in the minds of the Armenian population, these issues became the same. So when the Soviet Union started to collapse, the population in Soviet Armenia was very much ready to kind of claim this territorial, to bring these territorial issues to the forefront of their political agenda. And in this longer term, I think Moscow made a very big mistake by permitting very little but not trying to solve a bigger problem. So that's pretty much it, and I would be happy to answer your question, and I hope I didn't rush it through and I didn't make it way too complicated.
Yes, we can open up the floor to questions now.
Thank you. My name is Alan. I'm a graduate student at LSE. When reviewing the literature on national identity issues in Soviet Union, I got the impression that Soviet didn't have a coherent grand strategy regarding dealing with national identities. On one hand, each Soviet republic had its titular nation, which was based on a primordial approach, and on the other hand, Soviet introduced this concept of Soviet people. So when you mentioned that Soviet Union was flexible regarding the 1965 issue, do you consider that is because it didn't have a grand strategy and it was dealing with national identity issues on ad hoc basis, and because of that it showed certain flexibility?
Well, I mean, if you look at the way they were approaching this question of national identity, it's a very bizarre U-turn that they did. They started, before the revolution, they started with a constructivist approach to nations and national identity. They saw them as a byproduct of capitalism. some 30 years later, into Stalinist period, they very firmly moved away from the constructivist approach, and they very firmly are seeing it as in a very primordial terms. So on the one hand, they had some strategy, but on the other hand, they came back to this primordialist perception of national identity and nations. So longer term wise, they probably didn't have a very coherent strategy of dealing with this. But the problem here is, even if it's an authoritarian regime like Soviet Union, you cannot just decide we're going to do it this way one day and completely change it the next day. You get stuck in it. So once you take some route, it's very, very difficult to maneuver into a different route. And regarding the 60s, I think they were basically reacting to the situation arising in the periphery of the Soviet Union. They were trying to basically patch it as they could.
Felix Corley. I have two questions. First of all, a simple one. Is there any film footage of the events? And then the second question is, can you say a little bit about the role of the Catholicos, Vazgen, because he was there at the commemoration, and some people say he managed to calm the crowds, and some people say he didn't. I'd be interested to hear what you've read about that.
The footage should be available, but it's in a different archive. There is an archive of the films in Yerevan, so if they have the footage, it will be over there. I haven't seen the footage myself. Regarding Vazgen, it's a difficult question. I know why you're asking this question. I didn't see personally much of the discussions within the Communist Party of his role. What I imagine he would probably do, he would probably try to calm the situation down, because from other material that I found, the danger of using Soviet troops was very much on the agenda. So I believe if Vazgen was to intervene, he would be intervening, trying to prevent the violence rather than exciting the passions of the people.
Yeah, Lawrence Brewers. You said that you hadn't seen the footage of the demonstrations, but I'm interested in the visual materials. I mean, were there posters with kind of territorial imagery on the posters? And at that time, is there any evidence of actually the territories within the Soviet Union being portrayed? So Javakheti, Karabakh, Nakhchivan, and so on. So I'm just interested in this moment of fusion between these different sets of territorial claims.
Well, during the demonstrations itself, I haven't seen. There is a book, by the way. I forgot the author's name. The Armenian guy, he published it. It's available in English. I'll give you in Cambridge in a couple of days the details. He's doing a lot of that kind of visual aspect, how they presented the post. Yeah, yeah. So this is this. What I'm seeing from the letters that are appearing and are being written immediately before 1965 is basically people are beginning to fuse these two things together. This is happening very clearly in the minds of a lot of people who are writing the letters. Like before, it seems like the things were separate. The genocide is one thing. The territories in Azerbaijan and Georgia is another thing. But around 1965, they are beginning to blend together. And I have this letter, which is very beautifully summarizes this whole transformation. In order to do justice to the genocide, you need to give us territories. And this is very clearly is beginning to appear. And around this time, immediately after 1965 demonstrations, there was several letters that were signed by several thousand people addressed to Moscow, demanding the transfer of Karabakh. It's again very clearly related and fused with the genocide issue. I forgot to say another thing about the blunder of the Soviet authorities in Armenia. They have to respond to this mounting pressure from the population, so they start rehabilitating some of the writers that were executed during Stalinist period. They are trying to do some token symbolic things for the population, and one of such symbolic things is attempt to rehabilitate Andronik. And the funny thing is, Andronik's 100th anniversary was in 1965. And he was born in February. So in an attempt to rehabilitate Andronik, they published in February a number of newspaper articles commemorating Andronik. This is completely coincidental, but February is 2 months before April. So it sent a very clear message to the populations that we can speak about things that we couldn't speak several months ago, because Andronik is a very controversial figure. On the one hand, he is a warlord who was involved in fighting the Turkic population in Armenia, carrying violence against Turkic population. So there was immediately a big backlash coming from Azerbaijan against attempts to rehabilitate Andronik. On the other hand, he is pretty much the only person from Civil War era who can be rehabilitated because he never fought Soviet Union. All other kind of important military commanders from that era, they all fought Soviet Union. So Andronik was the only possibility to kind of get a national hero who stood up against the Ottomans, but still he was very controversial. And this was a purely coincidence that they tried to commemorate him in February 1965, just a few months before the demonstration. It sent a wrong signal to the populations that we can do much more. And when April 24, 1965 came, the population was already agitated and prepared. And what they see is closed lecture in Opera Theater to commemorate 50th anniversary of Soviet Armenia. And that kind of contributed to the explosion.
And have you come across any letters actually from Armenians in Karabakh or Jabakheti in connection with specifically these events?
One of these, this 1965, no, but one of these letters that I quoted was from a guy living in Georgia. I think the optimistic guy letters is from Georgia.
Thank you. You briefly mentioned that the 1965 events also had an impact on the Karabakh movement, but I would like you to refer to the how the event is connected to the Karabakh conflict itself when the Soviet Union did not exist anymore, because at that period the public discourse was about that the Karabakh conflict posed an existential threat, and they connected it to the genocide issue. They made a historical analogy saying that Azerbaijan and Turkey are connected, they were killing us back in those days and they are trying to do the same, and this to a certain extent helped Armenia to mobilize and fight against Azerbaijan. Do you find any such connections? Have you looked into the discourse in that period, and do you think this
I don't find anything in the terms you mentioned because people had to be very careful in the way they would put it. You can't blame Turkey a great deal, but you can't blame a neighboring republic in such an explicit terms. So usually the demands for the territories is coming through the references to Lenin, because Lenin was suddenly rehabilitated as a true kind of founder of the Soviet Union, not Stalin, who perverted him. And they're using these basically citations from Lenin when he says that we should kind of solve all the national conflicts in a peaceful manner to justify the transfer of the territory. So it's not in very kind of nationalistic and openly anti-Azerbaijani terms that this is being done. It's more kind of going along the rehabilitation of Lenin's position within the Soviet Union, that they're using this momentum to reclaim the territories.
How did this match with the development of academic study of the genocide? Because, you know, later on they'd have document books of, you know, documents about the genocide from the Russian archives and this type of thing. Did that take off in '65, or was it already there?
One of the people behind actually writing drafting the letter that Armenian Communist Party sent to Moscow requesting commemoration was John Kirakosyan, who was in a party, and he became basically the main genocide scholar in Soviet Armenia, published a number of volumes about that, documents, etc., etc., etc. So this is very much connected, but it really takes off after 1965 because Moscow kind of allowed to commemorate these events, and the Armenians obviously used this to kind of, address the desires of the population. So it's not happening before 65, but it really takes off after 65.
I'm just curious, speaking about the 60s and then we touched on Karabakh later on. I've done some reading, I'm not an academic, but were any people who were active before 65 sort of carrying on 30 years later with the letter writing and so on that was being sent up to Moscow in the claims to return Karabakh to Armenia?
It's difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly the same people. But for example, I think the first leadership of post-Soviet Armenia was already involved in 1965 demonstrations. I think that kind of it was in a culture of, subaltern culture of, kind of addressing these issues, very much present among academics or young students. So everybody knew about it, so I think it was very much alive under the surface.
Thanks.
Can I also just ask one last question? Is this part of a bigger project to look at in the impact of mass demonstrations and so on in the Soviet Union? Will you be looking at the demonstration effect of what happened in Armenia on commemorations of other mass deportations that were actually Soviet perpetrated in the 40s? So to be interested, is this part of a bigger project?
No, it's not. Well, it's partially part of another bigger project which I'm thinking of doing a book maybe in several years on how the Soviet symbolism was reinterpreted in a Soviet periphery. Because a lot of what I'm seeing in Soviet Armenia is they're using the socialist narrative and they're giving it a completely different meaning that people in Moscow would be horrified to discover on the ground. And I don't think this is very uniquely specific for the Armenians. It probably is taking place in Georgia, it probably is taking place in other parts of the Soviet periphery. So if I have enough money to travel around, I will probably do something on that, on how people in the Soviet periphery using the Soviet symbols to basically put forward their own national and different agenda from the central authorities.
It is not related to 65. It is related to 47. As far as I know, what I read in the Turkish material, Turkish Armenian memoirs, starting from 1946, Soviet Armenia invited all the Armenians to go to Soviet Armenia. And one of the guys that I know of, he was a communist, and he, Communist Party of Turkey, member of Communist Party of Turkey, he applied for the passport. Turkish authority gave him a passport, and he went to Soviet Armenia. Now you said that 80,000 of them went. And you also mentioned that Stalin was demanding land to put those 80,000 people, demanding from Turkey, 80,000 people. I heard that, not only from you, from other sources, but on 45 Boston Conference, Stalin was trying to convince Truman, no, I don't want any land. They are hypocrisy of the Turks. There is no need. If I want to have a land, I can go and get it. But I never threatened them. This is hypocrisy of Turks, he said. Clearly, it's written on the American material. How come same Stalin, same guy, is sort of going back to Armenia and saying that get them, invite them, and I'll get land from Turkey. It's a bit confusing.
Well, I think Stalin had some designs mainly for Constantinople, but also for the territories that belonged to Tsarist Empire, and they were lost to Turkey in 1921. So in order to legitimize the Soviet claim to these territories, they need to kind of present some backgrounds, and that's what they do, and they letting Georgians and Armenians to publish books addressing these things. So I don't really see any incompatibility with what they do in here. They did the same thing with northern Iran, so it's kind of coherent process of trying to expand the Soviet influence by using the national groups living in the periphery. So if Armenia and Georgia were to benefit from Turkey, then Azerbaijan was to benefit from northern Iran.
Well, my question is, how come settlers, 8,000 of them, sort of became a tool for negotiating the land?
Well, because then he would be able to say, well, we have all these people who were
But he
survived.
in 45, I don't want any land from Turkey.
Well, he changed his mind.
Well,
Is there any evidence? Did you find any evidence in your research of diaspora Armenians who'd migrated agitating for revolution?
These people who were arrested, the most radical one group of 7 people who were arrested for plotting to separate Armenia from Soviet Union and reconquer lands from Turkey. 2 of the 7 people were very recent repatriates. One was from Jerusalem, the other one was from Beirut. So I think they were quite active in rejecting the Soviet authority and Soviet legacy. And part of this rejection is they beginning to see that the Soviet authority cannot help them, it's actually preventing them. While others, and the majority of them, they can see that can work within the framework of the Soviet authority. So yeah.
There are no books to be published demanding land or putting the idea.
Yeah.
Could that be more to please for interior politics, the population of these countries, rather than externally, as an external politics, seriously think about demanding land?
Well, I think there is a danger if you kind of trying to please the population inside by promising them to get something from the outside and you don't intend to get it, the population will get really annoyed. So I think they were doing it quite consciously, expecting to gain some territories, and they were basically preparing the population to, that the new land will be coming in. But when it didn't materialize, they had to abandon the whole project. We have one person over there.
My question refers to what extent the genocide issue was covered in the Armenian Helsinki groups. Do you have any information about that? Have you covered that in your research?
I've read their kind of things. The Helsinki group was very kind of much in line with traditional Soviet dissidents. They were mostly speaking about the abuses of Soviet power, much less about the genocide issue, so they are more kind of mainstream dissidents on a Russian model. But I mean, I didn't specifically deal with Helsinki group in this research. It's from several years back.
And with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this lecture. I'd like to thank Dr. Saparov again for his very insightful talk. I welcome you all to talk to us after as well. Our next event will be in a few weeks' time, I believe, but we will get emails according to that. Thank you once again for attending.